Thank you very much for the introduction, Christina, and thanks very much for inviting me. Thank you to the museum for inviting me. This is really, for me, an honour and actually a really interesting experience. So thanks very much for coming along to this. I'm afraid I will, as I hope you knew before you came here, be talking in English, so and there's no translation, so I hope it will be clear what I have to say. And if it isn't clear what I have to say, well, we've got some marvellous posters to look at, so hopefully your time will be well rewarded, at least on that front. I've got to say, it is an extraordinary thing to me. I never I never take it for granted to be invited, from London to Zagreb to talk about one of the key figures of your design scene, your design culture. Perhaps you don't want to come here this evening and find me declaring myself completely unqualified to give this lecture, but I do find it quite strange. I tried to imagine earlier what it would be like in reverse if, say, one of your design writers or critics came to London to talk about one of our historical figures. Well, it would be interesting, but it's an unusual thing to occur, I think. So thank you very much for having me. This story goes back for me to 2002, which was the first time that I visited the country, and indeed Zagreb. I was invited to give a lecture then by Dejan Krizic, who is in the audience. And during my visit, he said that there had been an exhibition, I think it had already closed, at the Student Centre Gallery that he thought I would be interested in. And in fact, a curator friend of his took me to see this show, and it was indeed closed up, so I think it was over, but the posters, Borisa Bućana's posters, were still on the wall. So it was a snowy day, we went inside, and I was in there with my host, the curator, on my own, confronting this early material from, as I recall, the late 60s and the early 70s by Borisa Bućana. I wish I had a photograph of the installation, but I don't. All I have, and I just discovered it recently, just literally about a week ago, in a pile of things, I'd lost it. This leaflet, a folding leaflet for the exhibition. And we see there, I'm afraid this slide is a bit blurry, but the others are sharper. We see that in English there, it says, and obviously in Croatian as well, it says, Conceptual Design of Borisa Bućana. And it's funny, this idea of conceptual design, because all of these years since 2002, I've had it in my mind that what was really interesting about that work, seeing it there in Zagreb, was this conceptual dimension, that this was conceptual design. Now, last year I finally met Borisa Bućana and had a conversation with him, 2 conversations, but these were conducted through a translator, and if you've ever tried this, you'll know that it's an odd experience, because you're never really sure, even if the translator is good, and our translator was good, but you're never really sure if you're quite understanding what the person you're talking to, in this case Borisa Bućana, is saying. Is there a change in the tone which changes meaning? You don't really know. It's like you get half the story, but you don't. As I say, in my mind, everything I'd seen had been conceptual in some manner, but now subtle distinctions were being drawn between the posters. Some were influenced by pop art, some were influenced by minimalism, or a combination of the two, and then later there was the work, and I'm going to show all this and talk about it in a minute, which was influenced by developments happening at the same time in conceptual art. And Borisa Bućana back then, in the late 60s and the early 70s, was at least half of the time, or part of the time, on the conceptual art scene. He was part of those groups of artists, he knew those people, he knew what was happening. Now again, to complicate matters, when you ask Borisa Bućana about this now, he's quite dismissive of conceptual art. So it's really, at this distance, it's very hard for someone coming from the outside, as I have, to get a real sense of where we should locate this work. But still, in my mind, everything I'd seen, you know, for a whole decade really, from 2002 till 2013, when I finally wrote something about this work, the whole thing had been this intriguing episode in a kind of conceptual design, which I don't think we ever had, and certainly didn't have back then in the 60s and 70s in London. So this is why I was so surprised by what I saw, so impressed by it, and forced actually to reassess my view of what in this country design had been during that period. So it's like there was a missing chapter in my mind, and now finally I was catching up with it. Now, I was under a certain amount of pressure back then, after 2002, when I was still involved in I magazine, which I'd launched a few years earlier, under a certain amount of pressure perhaps to write something in I magazine about Borisa Bućana. But to be honest, I didn't really know how to start. It seemed to me this could only happen if I came back, because, you know, I had a budget to come back here, spend some time here, interviewed him. I heard that I would need to do it through a translator, and it all seemed impossible. Nevertheless, in 2013, and some of you may have seen this, I wrote a short piece on the Design Observer weblog called The Conceptual Posters of Borisa Bućana, and I think that's what came to the attention of Borisa Bućana himself and the museum, and it was decided to invite me to write this essay for the catalogue. But like I say, I'd spent sort of 10 years not getting around to this subject, and now finally I have done. I'm very pleased to do it. So here's a couple of early pictures. I think that the one on the left there of Bućana must be, I would guess, late 60s. He looks very young to me. And the one on the right is 1973. So it's exactly the period we're talking about. And I'm showing them partly because, you know, actually when you see a photograph of someone at the time, it really confirms your sense of the mystery of the research, the exploration, the excavation that you're undertaking. That's what I've sort of done here, but I'm immensely handicapped by not speaking the language, by the fact that when I made inquiries, it seems there are no interviews from that period with Borisa Bućana. Now these interviews for someone like me, a researcher, are really valuable because you can interview someone now in the present about what they did or thought, or, you know, think they thought 30 years ago. But that's not the same as having a document from the time which captures their ideas, their opinions, you know, as they were happening. Even that, you may want to ask questions of a document like that. You may not entirely trust it, but at least it's a record of something that was said at the time in the heat of the moment. In the case of this research, and I think this applies probably even to Croatian researchers, because of the lack of these kind of statements from the time, what we have to try to do, I suppose, is reconstruct as best we can from any evidence we can find what the artist, the designer, in this case Borisa Bućana, was actually doing back then. So this is just to give you a hint of the process I've been through, and actually the difficulties that it entails for me. What this means, actually, is that I'm not going to stand here in an auditorium full of people you know, who are much more acquainted with the history of that period than I am, and pretend to a kind of scholarship. That's not what's happened here. What's happened here, I think, is a building on the reaction I had back in 2002 to try and explore, in the first instance for myself, why this work was so interesting, and why it still seems interesting to me, and why I'm now trying to persuade people back home in London, I'm writing an article for I magazine, finally, why it's significant. And I can see, at a distance, I see it already. If you just show people a handful of posters, they find it hard to get it. And maybe that was the great thing. I walked into that exhibition in 2002, and I saw it all laid out in front of me, not as tiny reproductions, but full-size posters, the maximum impact that you can get from seeing something on the wall. And that, that's why I became something of a convert, an enthusiast for this kind of work. So let's just briefly look at a few of the posters that I'm talking about. This was certainly one of them, and this is one I remembered all those years, because it's a strange piece of work, the Imaginary Museum, we understand all that, but it's got these holes punched through the middle, so it's turned into a three-dimensional object, and then below it there's this chimney. How it relates to the subject, back then I had no idea. I could understand the Imaginary Museum part of it, but a poster this empty, this strange actually, in its reductiveness, in its minimalism, was really very striking. So I think this is the poster that Bućan regards as his first minimalist work from 1968. So it's right at the start of the period that we're talking about, and as you'll know, if you know his work at all, it was for the Student Centre Gallery, the very place in which I was seeing it. And I think, actually, in retrospect, most of the work in that show probably was posters created up until about 73 or so for the Student Centre Gallery. So there was that struck me as remarkable. It still strikes me as remarkable. Equally remarkable, in fact probably one of my personal favourite images by Bućan is this one from slightly later, 1970. Now I used this term conceptual design earlier, and this is one of the posters that we were talking about in relation to that. As Bućan describes it, it's influenced by minimalism. Obviously it's very minimal in form, but it's also influenced by pop art, the way in which pop art would stylize things by simplifying them, reducing them to outlines. Now I'm told that if you know anything about the work of the new tendencies, and of course extremely important art movement here, 50s into the 60s, then you won't be so surprised by these forms, the formal element, these strange telescopic devices in this image. But it's not a direct quotation of anything in the art. It's a kind of graphic distillation of the essence of the art, which then becomes something new. I guess I picked up even that much when I first saw it. But this is an example of what I mean about to my eye, coming from the outside, the absolute strangeness of this work. I couldn't think of a single piece of British design from that period, 60s through into the 70s, that looked remotely like this. I don't think that there is any American design that looks remotely like this. This is really, just in formal terms alone, something startling, something different, something new. But again, I don't want to go too far with that, because maybe in the broader context of design in Central and Eastern Europe, it makes a kind of sense. But again, I stress from the outside, this seemed radical. And when I said that we had a kind of missing, I had, and therefore people where I come from, English-speaking countries, have a kind of missing chapter, this is what I mean. I don't think work like this has ever properly been written into the international histories of graphic design and set alongside work from the same period, to try to decide what it really was. Be careful, because some of these things excite me so much I could talk about them half the evening. But let's just look at a couple more quickly. So this exhibition poster, 69, again, Student Centre Gallery, for Dalibor Martinez. I mean, look what's happening here. There is literally nothing in the middle of the poster. People said to Bućan, are you going to draw something in there? It was odd to people. Again, it's been explained to me in terms of a kind of distillation of certain forms you might have seen in the art. But what it doesn't do, in fact, what it refuses to do, what Bućan refuses to do, is merely to illustrate the art. And of course, we know, because we've seen a million museum and gallery posters, This is the standard way of proceeding. You find a representative artwork and you photograph it and you put it on the poster and you have some nice type and there is your poster. Bućan says, and I agree with him on this, that that's not actually a poster. No, a poster should be a thing in its own right. It should be a new work, a response, if you like. It has to go further. Simply to show a photograph is not enough. Of course now, this is what design, and I think it's probably even happening here, it's certainly the case in London, this is what design has become. If you look at an exhibition poster, in 2016, once again, until the end of time, what we see is a photograph, a respectful photograph of an artwork, and then the designer's job is just to sort of select and crop the picture, or bleed it to all edges, or whatever, minimal design procedures, and then to put some nice type, probably a sans serif, something, unexciting and vaguely contemporary looking on it, and that's it. I mean, it certainly isn't art, but it's barely design. So again, to come back to this, it proposes something radically different, doesn't it? It actually asserts, back in 1969, when Bućan was still a young man, barely out of art school, it asserts the designer's right to create a freestanding piece of work, which has a relationship to the art, but is something new and different, is a response, if you like. Another very similar poster. This again would be in my personal kind of list of Bućan greatest hits. I just think it's extraordinary. Another poster with a void in the middle. Again, there is a reference to some of the formal elements you would see in the artist's work, but it's an extraordinary piece of reduction, minimalism, whatever we want to call it. There is nothing there, or there is a void there, or there is an invitation to enter a void. A hole has opened up in the pictorial space and we can drop right in and find whatever we like there. Absolutely extraordinary. And again, I'm sorry, I won't dwell on it for the entire lecture, but to go back to 2002 when I first saw this, it seemed to me that there were things happening in this work back in 1970, all those decades ago, which very much intersected, coincided, overlapped, whatever word you want to use, with what was then happening in a new kind of conceptual design which was emerging among young designers internationally. It was a genuinely international movement. It had started at the end of the 90s, and by the new decade, it went up. 2002, it was really underway, and in the end it became a kind of default. So here we are. Bućan had anticipated a development, if you like, which took several decades to catch up with him. So now I would argue we have the eyes that we need to see this work properly. Just to give this a bit of context, I want to show just a handful, not many, examples. I looked around for things that might relate in some way to what Bućan was doing. I even mentioned Jan van Toorn in the Netherlands to him, but he dismissed it. He didn't. I don't know if he knew the work or whether it was just my description. He didn't think that it sounded very similar. I don't want to press the point, actually. I think it's a bit similar. Van Toorn created a series of posters for the Stedelijk Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, a long series, but actually in the main, even though they are quite experimental in form, and they exhibit a huge graphic variety, which is similar to what we see in Bućan's work. He's not fixed like a Müller-Brockmann to a way of working which always produces similar results, within its own kind of formal language. Van Toorn, like Bućan, is hugely varied. He's not committed to one style or one approach. So here, here's an exhibition from 1967. This one, 3 years later, for an exhibition of Jos Mander's work, again at the Van Abbe Museum, goes even further. I mean, I guess this is someone's behind, but it's, I think it's intentionally vague. But the point is, it's reduction. There's very little there. This too seems to have moved into a more conceptual space. It's making quite big demands of the viewer. If you expect in a poster to see things going on, here's an image in which very little is going on, in which you're drawn into a conundrum, a mystery. You're asked a kind of question. However, if you look at that line, or those few lines of type up there at the top, even though I don't think that Jan van Toorn is a designery designer who's obsessed with visual form, still the typography is very controlled and very neat, and in the end the whole package is well put together and nicely, almost tastefully resolved. Okay, one more example. A couple of designers, John Mellin and Anders Österlin, sometimes or commonly known as M&O, they're a duo, in Stockholm. And they did a whole series of posters for the Modern Art Museum in Stockholm. This, you're seeing 3, I just copied this from a book page. And what we have here is just an invitation to come to the museum. So the top one says, today, question mark. The lower left-hand one says, at lunch. Below that it says open all day, and then on the other one it says tonight. So, you can see long opening hours. Again, the point here is the extreme reduction. Empty space, graphic symbol. In this case, there is a kind of series continuity, an attempt to build what we might call a brand identity now. So you come to recognize this as one of the museum's posters. But the operations, the kind of graphic reduction that's happening here has some sort of kinship, I think, some proximity to what Bućan does. I think you see that again in this poster, created just by John Mellin alone, 3 years later, so same time frame that we're talking about. It's for a Kunsthal, or art palace, temple, museum place in Lund. Again, it's actually quite designery. This grid is very, very well controlled. But there is something about it that relates it, perhaps a little distantly, to Bućan. But be assured, I've looked hard and I'm struggling to find anything that compares in a very direct way with what Bućan does. I think this is along the same general lines like Jan van Toorn, but not too close. So let's look at one more example for context. Your very own Mihailo Arsovsky. I just want to look at 3 examples here. Now again, this is local history, so you know this, but it points up very clearly what is distinctive about Bućan's work, because clearly, I believe this word says love, or maybe a colloquial word for love, if I've got that right. 1966, so slightly earlier than Bućan's work, but clearly this is very much the creation of a designer. The designer is having fun with the letter forms. I mean, you could say, well, there's a hint of Dada or something there in the playfulness with which this word is constructed from letter forms. But still, the idea, if we're going to describe it as an idea or a concept in this piece of work, is all to do with a kind of exciting arrangement of typographic material. And there isn't really anything else there. I mean, there's enough there because it's so well done. It's big and it's bold and it's exciting and it's certainly eye-catching and you notice it, and so it functions really well. But it is not trying to be an artwork, unless, and there's a separate discussion to have here, unless we start to argue that even this sort of typographically focused work can be a form of art. But I don't think it's created in that spirit. I think it's created by a master designer who is absolutely able to play his instruments brilliantly and is content to do that extremely well and then to stop there. And so if we... Oops. I hope I didn't get out of sync. I'm pressing 2 buttons at once here on two different systems, unfortunately. If we look at this poster, 1971, it's the same thing again, but more modernist for sure, a more purified kind of design. But everything hinges here on the drama of the typographic articulation and the absolute precision, so this is an optical precision of the placement of the typographic elements. And that's it again. The type is allowed to do all the work. If there's an idea, it's a typographic idea, but there it stops. Even when Arsovsky introduces pictures, he tends to treat them almost like they were units of typography. And he creates these effects of repetition and so on, which are absolutely in keeping with the time. This is a poster for a student disco, and it absolutely says disco. It functions brilliantly. And in the colours, there's a reference, a controlled, structured reference, but still a reference to psychedelia, the music of the time. All of that is in there. But still, the image, the repetition of the image is really about a graphic effect, about creating a kind of graphic rhythm, and it's the rhythm that excites you and relates back to the music and so on. So, again, it's a thought-through piece of work, but it functions within the terms of graphic design. And I would say that's very, very different from what we see in Bućan's work, and I'll develop that theme as I go. From now on, what I've done is to really divide things up thematically. So first of all, I want to whiz through examples of work from this early period where Bućan makes graphic references. So he too plays with graphic material. But I don't think it's out of any kind of fetishistic attachment to the graphic for its own sake. That's not why he's doing it. In fact, I think it's just material which happens to be graphic, which maybe relates, as here, to the subject in some way. So, this is an exhibition of graphic art, so it's entirely reasonable, therefore, to play with graphic imagery. And he turns it, this is, again, a very early piece of work, turns it into almost a kind of comic strip. He has fun with the... But at the same time, it's not like the Arsovsky. It's not precious in that way at all. It's an idea, an exploration, and it doesn't lead to anything. And I asked Bućan about this because I was intrigued by this, the way he keeps restlessly. New idea, move on. Another idea, move on. Do it once or twice, move on again. Why not stick with something? His answer to that was simply, he thinks that's what people with not much talent do. They get stuck in a rut, I suppose, and they repeat themselves. So this is absolutely a characteristic of the work, that he seems to refuse the idea of development through repetition, or see very much value in this. So we have a graphic work like this, but I don't want to overstate it for that very reason. Again, it's interesting if you look at the more typographic posters, you usually find that the typography is there because it happens to function in terms of an idea that Bućan thought was relevant or interesting to the subject. So, it is rather clever the way this works, the way Balthazar becomes conqueror at the bottom. Apparently the word "or" is there in the title, but that's been dropped, but that's fair enough. But the way in which, if you look at A and S, they're exact reversals of each other. The way in which the A in Balthazar, at the end of Balthazar, turns into the accent above the C. It's all been carefully, logically thought through. And yet again, my feeling is, while it is a typographic work, it's not particularly concerned with the precise nuances of typographic placement in the way that we see Müller-Brockmann or Arsovsky or Wim Kral or whoever. It's really not concerned with that at all. It's just interested in the idea of transformation, and it applies that notion to words in this instance. But it doesn't then lead to a whole group of pieces in which Bućan again repeats the trick and tries it different ways. He does it and he moves on. There was a whole series of posters for the student-centred gallery for artist exhibitions, and Bućan had the idea of just numbering them. Extraordinary notion in a way to say, well, the number alone could be an intriguing kind of identity. you know, maybe I'll talk a little bit as we go about the whole question of client relationships, but I do think this work benefited at this stage from clients who were on the same age, same wavelength, and extraordinarily open-minded about what a poster might be. As Bućan says himself, as you all know in the audience, today, if you depart from some fairly predictable and narrow lines, you immediately encounter marketing resistance. People who say, but how is that going to persuade people or sell our event to the audience we want? Does it appeal to the maximum number of people? It's ambiguous and we need clarity. And, you know, so it goes on. Here, you know, he even includes around the edge this kind of trail of experiments in letter number distortion leading to the final image. So yeah, there are these graphic works. That's what we're exploring at the moment. This one for the Gavella Theatre takes the Gavella logo and for a play that comes out in English as Tonight We Improvise by Pirandello. What does Bućan do? He improvises with the theatre logo. So, you know, again, he has some graphic play, but it doesn't become a kind of project that he then returns to over and over again. This, like so many of the posters, this one stands out almost as a kind of oddity or an anomaly, an irregularity, something that, you know, at times you wonder how it ever came about. Just seems that he had a frame of mind at that point where almost anything could be tried or was possible. Quite interesting, because I've heard graphic designers say to me, Alan Fletcher, who I think I mentioned earlier, in London said to me once, you know, that's what graphic design is. It's just coming up with whatever works as communication. And when you hear it stated like that, you think, that's brilliant. Why isn't graphic design like that? But in fact, most graphic designers think on fairly well-defined lines. It's very rare to find a graphic designer who has no commitment to any stylistic direction whatsoever and will literally try anything that occurs as a possibility. But that's what we see in this body of work. This one, Total Design, Wim Crowell, who you know, well, I assume you know, I mean, it's had so much publicity in recent years and has become a kind of hero figure. There was an exhibition of his company, Total Design, based in Amsterdam, here in the Student Centre Gallery, and well, the idea needs no explanation whatsoever. So again, just playing with graphic resources. And this one too struck me as a quite surprising thing. You may know this novel by Thomas Mann called Felix Krull, Confidence Man, or Con Man for short, and this is a dramatisation of the book. So the idea seems to be here that each of the separate Lufthansa tickets, which are references to German culture in a very general way, represents a kind of impersonation or an element of fake identity. This is something that I'm still re-evaluating and thinking about, and it was seeing these pieces, there are 16 altogether, a series called The Development of Scientific Thought, seeing them in the exhibition, you know, really quite blew me away. I'd seen some of them small in reproduction, I didn't really get them, I didn't realise they had so much graphic impact. And it's interesting looking at them because they're incredibly free, conceptual, graphic interpretations of different aspects of science. So here we see Freud, obviously. The middle one is about the animal origins of man, and the one with the DNA strand in is about the secret of life. And you know, because you can see them all outside. They have enormous impact, and they are extremely considered. You know, there are times when Bućan seems almost willfully to be rejecting the role of designer, even as he does graphic design of a kind, you know, of a special kind, but still, you know, he's in the field and and he was signing things Bućan design, you know, so he was positioning the work as design at least part of the time. And you come to work like this, and I just think that they're extraordinary examples of imaginative designing, where the designer, you know, using graphic language, has real power to encapsulate ideas in strong, enticing graphic form. So very, very interesting. Some of you probably know that last year in London there was an exhibition, a big exhibition about pop art from parts of the world which are less familiar in the telling of the pop art story. And there was a lot of work from Central and Eastern Europe. And near the end of the exhibition, there was a whole wall devoted to this project by Bućan called Bućan Art from 1972. So the very period we're talking about, the period of these early conceptual posters. And you know, this is a really interesting project in retrospect, which looks, I must say, I don't know how it was understood at the time or how it was received, but it seemed, looking at it now and looking at people's responses, that people get it now as never before. It's almost like a project which has come of age over time, all these years later. And maybe we interpret it in a slightly different way than Bućan originally intended, but that's fine. Isn't that the way with rich cultural work? It's open to interpretation and reinterpretation and new interpretations over time. Well, we see immediately what's happening. The Swiss Air logo, I guess that disappeared long ago, but has become Swiss art. That's what happens in Bućan art. The original logo or graphic device is replaced by the work art. So we move on, and we see the famous Marlborough packet design, you know, almost iconic, again replaced by art. So what's happening here? It's as though Bućan is presenting art at this point in 1972 as a master narrative that can somehow absorb and subsume even the efforts, the manifestations, the plans of the corporate world. I mean, we might say in retrospect, wow, that's amazingly optimistic. And this brings me on to what, you know, how we might view this now, because actually what we know is that art is increasingly colonized by commercial and corporate forces. So there's something deeply ambivalent and double-edged about this fusion of the notion of the autonomous artwork with this regimented corporate imagery. And there seems to be some doubt as to how many of these works, paintings, obviously they're all paintings, as if you've seen them outside you know, how many he created altogether. It may be about 30, I don't know if Bućan himself knows anymore. This is a section of the wall. This is Warhol's cow wallpaper in the background, so that it's plastered all over the wall, and then there's a long row of these things running along this end wall. They looked fantastic. I mean, it was one of the strongest pieces in that exhibition. There's a lot of things which are of historical interest, but in truth look a bit flimsy, and not terribly convincing now, even if they look convincing back in the 70s or whenever. But Bućan art stood up brilliantly, and again, you know, I don't need to explain all the references there to BMW and Pan Am and all the rest of it. Or maybe the Avis one, which is the art with the white band at the top. Okay, this brings me on to photography. And this was interesting because again, in the current version or the current thinking about how this work had evolved in the early 70s, the work becomes conceptual when it becomes photographic. I'm challenging that. Actually, to me, it seems much more blurred as an issue than that. But there is no doubt that the photographic pieces are very conceptual. But maybe, are they conceptual in a fine art way? I I guess there are critics who've written about the work from that direction. I've read some of that writing, Croatian writing, in translation, and it's not always very well translated, so it left me rather unconvinced. I would really like to see the relationship between Bućan's work and conceptual art of the time explored more closely in a way that made sense to me. Anyway, this is a conceptual piece, because here is a poster for an exhibition of Arsovsky's work, and what it shows is a poster frame from the street, so the kind of place you would have encountered Arsovsky's work and Bućan's work, for that matter. This is the conditions they operated in. Someone just pasted up their poster on top of other posters, all of the posters together in these frames in competition. Right, very unprecious, very awkward kind of space in many ways. So the trick was simply to do a really good poster that stood out from the others. The thing about this that just amazes me, this piece from '72, is that it doesn't show anything by Arsovsky. And that Arsovsky agreed to that. I mean, it's unimaginable now that if you were to do a poster about a show of work by Neville Brody or Jonathan Barnbrook or someone, that they would ever agree not to have their work shown on the poster. And yet, in these conditions of freedom, that was possible. I'm going to shoot over some of these and not discuss them at great length. This does show an exhibition poster for Željko Stojanović, sorry about my pronunciation. Doesn't need much explanation. It's a very kind of Rolling Stones, Andy Warhol kind of visual concept there. But funny, there's always, I hope it's funny. It's worrying if it wasn't meant to be funny, but I think it was. That was a regular photographic collaborator, so we're going to see that name over and over again. This is a good example of something that I don't think was understood in London. Perhaps I should have explained it more, because they probably, when I sent this poster to iMagazine, they just thought, well, what's so interesting about that? It's just a picture of Frank Sinatra. They probably even concluded it was for a Frank Sinatra concert. But of course it isn't. It's actually to announce a dramatic work by Bertolt Brecht called In the Jungle of Cities. It couldn't be less fitting, appropriate, well-matched to the subject. It's completely jarring. It's an absolute provocation. And furthermore, there is a line on the poster, you can't read it here, but it's just down there at the bottom, under Sinatra's hands, which says, the poster was made for another show. So, I just thought I couldn't use it there, so I'll use it here instead. And there's a whole series of these which repeat this line. And again, extraordinarily, the Gavella Theatre agreed to this. I mean, wow, those were the days. And we might wonder about that. I mean, I could go off on a big tangent here about this, because, of course, if you're, and Bućan said this to me himself, he made these posters for clever people. In other words, people who would understand the jokes, the references, the deliberate refusal to give you the expected thing that you'd normally get. So in other words, they were posters for a sophisticated audience. And here we come back to the problem of marketing, because marketing will immediately say now, sure, yeah, fine. If you just want to talk to that small group of people, we could go this way. If we want to pull more people in, we are going to need an approach that more people will understand. And this is the great dilemma, and we might even say, now, 2016, the tragedy for design and what design has become. Design, as it evolved over time in relationship to art, in the work of people like Bućan, but others as well, became something extraordinarily sophisticated. It really did inhabit a space, just as Bućan's work inhabits a space somewhere between art and design, a space that doesn't feel it needs to resolve itself one way or the other. And there is now an audience of people who get that, and it's not a problem, and they don't insist on it being art or design, and how boring to insist on these categories. And we're all postmodern, so we believe in hybridity, let everything fuse and meld and become extraordinary and new. that's the intellectual program, if you like, but then there's the reality of how you engage audiences. And when you say, well, we need the maximum number of people, so we must do safe things the maximum people will understand, then of course you restrict what design will do. All of this work inhabits a kind of special zone, a kind of enchanted domain before that happened. Even in just starting to happen in New York, happens a bit later in London. Now we're completely locked into the marketing program. I guess it's now happening here, and it's happening to you. And these spaces of freedom are closed down. Here we see the poster in the street. Fantastic. It's a lovely image. Another one from the series, a poster made for another show entirely with these sumo wrestlers on. Wonderful. I like these a lot, but that you actually you do need to explain them to really get them. Wow, there's an amazing moire effect on that. Just want to talk about a little bit about the theme of self-reference in this work, because I hadn't grasped that before coming here last year, meeting Bućan and seeing more of the posters than I'd ever seen before. And it kind of amazed me, because I don't think it's something that designers did back then. Since then, we have had people like Stefan Sagmeister or Vaughan Oliver in London who include images of themselves in their own work. But Bućan was doing this back in the early 70s. And his attitude, I asked him about it a bit, seemed to be, well, I'm living it. This is my life, I'm living it, I'm doing this every single day. I'm trying to create work which exists as a work, as an artwork in its own right, and it's by me, and so, yes, I put myself in the work. So this is an exhibition poster, so fair enough, for his own exhibition, he's put himself in the work for Bućan Art in Dubrovnik. I'm assuming that this is his arm again in a cast, but we don't have time to unpack all of this, but a wonderfully kind of self-referential piece of work there. And then we get this amazing poster for the 18th Yugoslav Theatre Festival, where, as I say in the catalogue essay, he becomes almost a kind of martyred figure, a Saint Sebastian, but instead of being pierced by arrows, he's adorned with the tools of his own trade, the pieces of paper which it is his job, his calling, his responsibility to make available as a designer to the public. He seemed to like the fact that in Novi Sad they wouldn't know who he was, but it actually says, a line on the poster, the designer photographed in his room. So there's these threads of self-reference running through the work. Another one from the series showing a Zagreb writer photographed in the theatre, so applying the same kind of techniques there. This one. It just is one of the ones that completely amazes me, the audacity of it. It's for the Equestrian Club event, and you might at the very least expect horses, equestrian horses. Bućan himself said he thought they'd probably have liked horses jumping over hurdles. What they got was this naked woman with this kind of wig, ponytail down her back representing a horse's tail. And incredibly, they invited him back the next year to do another poster where he pushed it even further. I mean, utterly incredible. I would love to see this kind of thing on the streets of London, but it's never going to happen, unfortunately. Well, continuing with the theme of self-reference, you probably mused on this one if you've seen the exhibition, where he's paid in America for 3 pieces of work, amounting to the grand total of $6, and that becomes then the principal visual motif on this theatre poster. His name in the middle, again, at foregrounding himself, placing himself at the heart of the design process. Making, I don't know if it was some big desire to be famous or whether it was simply a kind of statement of the obvious. I did make this work, so why shouldn't I insert myself visibly in the work? But nevertheless, he did that, and he did that with the same kind of freedom an artist creating from their own life would bring to an artwork. Wouldn't for 1 minute question doing a self-portrait. Artists do self-portraits all the time. What Bućan has given us is kind of graphic self-portraits. So here we learn about the state of his finances. And here we meet his girlfriend, and a line, well, it's the title of the exhibition, it says, "I made this poster for my girlfriend." And I love the way his name, because it's his own work in the show, is like a kiss on her lips, just up there. And if you look at what's happening typographically, just to go back to that theme, the words turned into bracelets and so on, Muller Brockman or Wim Krauw would never do that. They wouldn't be able to do that. They would be appalled by the idea of treating type in that casual, offhand manner. So, Bućan is really not concerned to be a designer in that sort of tidy, careful, exacting, Arsovsky-like way. That's just not what this work is about, and that is what makes it so interesting. Okay, I don't want to go on too long, so I'm going to really whiz through this. It's interesting to me what seems to happen in the late 70s. So this is mid-70s, 76, but it starts to happen here. When I saw a lot of the work, I felt, even though there are strong posters, there is a sense of, and maybe Bućan wouldn't agree with this, I don't know, but I'm just saying as a viewer, there is a sense that he's getting a bit bored or tired of doing this. It's not working so much anymore. He becomes almost kind of crazily willful in the things he'll try. So here, suddenly we're killing cartoon characters. And again, this, although Bućan obviously has extremely refined craft skills, we see that in some of the earlier work. If he wants to do that, he can do it. But here, he's deliberately coarse or crude or slapdash. That's part of how this poster works. It's a bit of a shock. It's not just in the subject matter, but actually in its visual handling. But still, although I think it's fine, I don't think it shows the same sense of purpose that you see in the earlier work, from the late 60s through to the mid-70s, even though he varies the work enormously and he never settles on a single thing or a single style. But still you feel certain ideas or approaches, a method, in the broadest sense, is being worked through. By the end of the 70s, I get this feeling that the work is slightly at sea. He's not sure what it should become now, and so we see even more graphic variation than ever. You would never know that the designer who created this also could create this. There is a book produced in London called Smile in the Mind, and it's all about the use of wit and humour in graphic design, which is a very British thing. The British love that. Reduce everything to a tidy little graphic design, a little graphic design that provokes a smile, and you've communicated with your audience. And that's here. Okay, it's quite surprisingly frank, for sure. But it's that kind of graphic thinking, and there we see the source. I'm sure you knew it anyway. This famous poster, which was in, I think, a Dylan Greatest Hits album, but cleverly repurposed for a Glazer show. But still, when we think of the Bućan we've known up until that point, it no longer feels like him. It's what I've said. I think he's sort of casting about. 1979, what do I do next? What do I do now? And of course, as we know, he was about to resolve that spectacularly. You see a hint of what's to come in this poster from 1979. These crazy, angular, optical graphic patterns. Again, it doesn't really look like a Bućan, but actually, in retrospect, when we see what comes next, it does look like a Bućan. It looks like the new phase of Bućan, which is emerging. Interesting poster, because here, this is Bućan, of course, in typical self-referential way, down there in the bottom left-hand corner. confronting the path ahead of him, and the path ahead of him leads through all these titanic artists. So, you know, I guess that's Giacometti at the top and Evard Munch's Scream there in the middle. Examples, I mean, you could call, there's this term that's been used sometimes, the so-called anxiety of influence. And that's what this is about. How do I create something which is mine, which is fresh and original to me, which takes on board, you know, the achievements of art history, maybe refers to them in some way, but which is my own. And here in 1980, as he reaches the end of the phase I've been talking about, the early phase, he contemplates that dilemma. And again, you see this on the wall, it's a stunning piece of work. You know, I would never have known from seeing it in a book that it had the tremendous kind of almost visceral graphic impact that it has. And that alone shows that something new is emerging, that there's an energy, an emotionalism, an expressionism, we might say, emerging through the work, as well as, you know, an ornamental quality. It's all exploding out at this point, trying to find a future direction. Becomes more focused in this famous image, 1981. I'm sure you know the Helmut Newton source image that this references. It's for you know, a Greek dramatic work, so there's a reference there to Greek vases and so on. It's a clever piece of work, and again, when you see this thing enormous in front of you, has tremendous impact. The kind of impact it has is different from the early work. It's as though the visual, which has always been well, it's been used, but in a qualified way. You know, the minimalism, the reduction, the going to concept, the emptying out of the image, all these things he was doing earlier, he now realizes, I guess, is what happened, don't really suit him. It's not, maybe at root it's not who he really was. The thinking, the ideas, that's who he was, for sure, but actually he's a person with enormous visual energy, and it starts to emerge at this stage. More self-reference, of course, these fantastic source photos. If you've seen the catalogue, you know where we're headed, which is to this poster here. Again, we were talking about this earlier, the conversation between the artist, the designer, and the producer of kitsch, celebrating 30 years of Ulupu, if I've said that right, but anyway, the Croatian Association of Artists of Applied Arts. And, you know, it's, again, I need to bring this to a close, so I won't dwell on it at great length, but it's ambiguous, because you might say, well, presumably, Bućan is not calling himself the producer of kitsch, but is he calling himself the artist or the designer? And you might then conclude, well, the artist must be this wacky, angular guy in the chair, so that makes the guy in the Hawaiian t-shirt the producer of kitsch, which means that Bućan is drawn very neatly there and looking very reflective, is the designer. But why, in 1981, as he makes a huge bid for the poster as autonomous artwork, you know, it was there implicit all along, but now it becomes absolutely overt, spectacular statement he makes there. Why at that point does he say he's designer? Surely he should be saying he's artist. So it's as though, you know, maybe there's a kind of acknowledgement that if you're creating art in the sphere of the applied arts, that these three things are all wrapped up together, you know, and there's no purity. But anyway, once again, you know, an ambiguous, ambivalent image, which we can talk about at some length. I'm interested too in the graphic style here. Again, you know, I've come to this work late, as it were. I was very concerned with the early posters, the ones that I'd seen way back in 2002, and then I was asked to write about those posters in the catalogue. And it was only really on that research trip last year that I started to see the big posters, you know, actually see the things for the first time and realise quite how amazing they are. And now, you know, seeing that top floor in the exhibition, it makes me want to think again. In fact, I find myself now more, you know, yeah, even, well, more engaged than I've ever been with the large-scale work of the 80s, but also wondering about whether to write about that too, because it, you know, it really is incredible work. Coming back to this piece, I was intrigued by the graphic style, and because I haven't researched this, I don't know what the sources were, but it immediately made me think of, for instance, these two pieces of work from 81 and 1980. I'm quite sure Bućan had not seen this New York graphic cartoon magazine called Raw, published from 1980. That's the first cover that we see on the right. But you know, the angularity, the use of pattern, the whole ambience, the sitting figure even, seemed very close to what Bućan was doing too. And then if we look at on the left here, this really famous sideboard by Ettore Sottsass, famous Italian designer, member of the Memphis movement, which used these laminated surfaces with patterns. You know, the graphic form here of the piece itself seems extremely close to what we see in the Ulupu poster. So I'm not suggesting that Bućan had seen any of this, but I just think it's as though at that moment he was completely in tune with what we might as well just call the zeitgeist. That there was a spirit of the times then, caught by Memphis on the one hand and Raw magazine in New York, and you know, here in Zagreb, Bućan seemed to anticipate the same tastes, the same fashions, the same trends in pattern and styling, and somehow incorporate all of this into these early large form posters. So, you know, we're moving on to this, 83. Does this not distill precisely the kind of graphic language that I was talking about, also coincidentally? Has the sitting figures, and again I talk about Raw magazine, they loved this idea of cartoon characters who were also examples of art world styling, exactly what we've seen, you know, with the earlier figure sitting in the chair, and now see with this female figure on the left here, this angular form. Extraordinarily suggestive pieces of work. I'm including this just because it's my personal favourite, actually, and no better reason than that. A masterpiece, an extraordinary image. And, you know, again, what a huge journey it's been from that work in the late 60s with its reduction, its minimalism, its, you know, its refusal almost of graphic language, it's wanting to distill everything down, make it hard and definite. And now here, this explosion of colour, of graphic form, and a kind of almost subtropical surrealism. I mean, I can't begin to understand or know how that relates to the cultural scene here in Zagreb. It seems international in its outlook. It seems to incorporate influences from South America. An absolutely extraordinary piece of work. And we see very typical of Bućan in this era of his work, the problem of type, what to do with the type. He doesn't really want the type in the middle of the image. He doesn't want to resolve it into a graphic construction in the time-honoured graphic designer way. You know, that's the essence of 20th century graphic design. He finds a panel, and the canopy becomes a panel, and he pushes it up to the top. And what you see below, well, it's a painting, isn't it? I mean, it's a poster, but it's actually a painting on a poster. It's not illustration in any very direct sense, I think. You know, this summer festival, it's a broad interpretation of the festival or carnival spirit, I suppose, but it's become the opportunity to create what is in effect an artwork in the street. So he's finally done it at this point. The work always was art in the guise of design. It made that statement very, very clearly, but still, a smallish poster is a smallish poster, and it's up with other posters. Here, by bursting out of the normal poster frame and producing something on such an epic scale, he makes the point that you can have a form of poster painting in the street. An extraordinary thing back in '83 even, let alone, you know, were it possible today, to even attempt. So, really, you know, forcing me once again to reassess my view of what the European poster has been during that period. We'll just end with this one. Again, we were having a long chat earlier. I guess Rocco and Tsitsibela are more familiar to you. I understand that they were real people. They've been the subject of, well, a film in 1978, poems, songs, endless retelling of their story, this poor couple who lived in a boat until one day the boat was blown away by a storm, and so we see the boat there in this Rocco and Tsitsibela image that Bućan created for a drama production, not the film, and these tempest-like energies shooting across the image and disrupting it. But look, again, look what's happened here. Think of where we started from and what we've reached 15 years later. It's pure, unbridled graphic energy. You know, it's a graphic tempest. There is very little in graphic design quite like this. It relates to some other fine artists we can think of who've used strong pattern, optical effects, these pulsing lines of energy. But again, it's another spectacular painting in the street. So, yeah. That's where I think I'm going to close it. I could round off and recapitulate my main themes, but I think you get what I'm saying, which is that in this body of work, what we see is a consistent examination of the relationship between art and design, and one that right from the start, all the way back into the 60s and absolutely by this point, refuses to accept that there should be some strong dividing line. And on one side is artists with all their freedom, and on the other side is the designer who serves the client and only supplies what the client wants or needs, or perhaps a little bit extra. No, Bućan says, why can the framework of popular communication not be used to carry much more exciting, involving, experimental inputs from the so-called designer, or designer artist, poster designer artist, whatever we're going to call the figure who does this. Why is this work not possible? So we know, and I've said it all the way through, increasingly it's extremely hard to do. It is, but it stands there as a reminder of what is possible. And the reason a show like this is so enormously valuable is it means that young, I guess some of you in the audience, young designers or artists who are interested in design maybe can come in and see what has been possible, and hopefully will be inspired to push for something equally spectacular for the present visual environment. Thank you very much for listening. So the issue of copyright.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, a very good question. I mean, do you really want to get into a debate about copyright? As someone said, I heard someone say different times, and it's true. Of course, if you look back at, and you don't have to go back too far, you can see visual communicators, including designers, finding images. Artists do this too, of course, even more than designers, repurposing them, reusing them, turning them into something else. And in the process of doing that, there is often a violation of copyright. And sometimes, as we know, people, the creator of the original image, a photographer or whoever, wants to stick up for that and make the point. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think now, because that is a historical image, it's highly unlikely that anyone's going to want to fight over it in the courts, and maybe we should have a kind of cut-off line where we say, well, or statute of limitations, that's the phrase, where we just say, well, this is from an earlier time, it was acceptable then, it isn't acceptable now, but we'll just argue about it when it comes to present-day work. But for myself, I have tremendously mixed feelings about this. Because on the one hand, yes, we should defend the right of the creative person to control their own copyright. And that sounds like a really good principle. But when that principle is applied, in the corporate sphere, where imagery is owned, for instance, by corporations which have massive global presence and influence, at that point we might want to say, but isn't it good that people, artists, designers too, can comment on their culture and answer back to their culture by taking these images, you know, and yes, twisting them round and changing them and adding to them and taking away all the rest of it to turn them into a new argument that exposes something about the source material. And the idea that in, you know, 100 years in the future, we have this highly policed corporate world in which you cannot do this because they are so effective, these corporations, in kind of shutting you down, that's kind of worrying. So what I'm saying is I think this is double-sided, the copyright issue. And personally, you know, I find it hard to get too upset about the use of that Sinatra image, but now, of course, you know, you would have to go to the photographer and get permission and pay a fee and all the rest of it.
There is no name of the photographer also, eh? On the poster.
I don't think so in the case of that one, no. No. It was probably just seen as a news image, and so it's out there, and, you know. Yeah.
Another question?
Yes, hello.
I just wanted to go back to you saying that today marketing and marketing way of thinking kind of constricts the artist and the designer, as it's supposed to kind of approach masses, and it's more about the numbers and the number of people it's supposed to kind of invite. Would you say that it's a bit unfavorable then to kind of praise Bućan as being very free and very not having boundaries, as most of his posters are kind of for a niche, for young intellectuals. They're mostly exhibitions or posters for theater, which kind of entails a group of people, as he said to you that his posters are more for intelligent people. Kind of gives him more freedom than other artists, because his posters, and the purpose of the poster is for this kind of group that maybe will have more understanding for his freedom. Would you agree, or kind of?
Well, all right. What I think we need at this point, given that there are these cultural restrictions now, which come from actually the cleverness of marketing as a kind of control system. What we need we need the niches, we need spaces where we can do our own thing, where we can step outside of the standard frameworks and restrictions, that if we want a truly vibrant culture, here in Zagreb or in London or everywhere, anywhere and everywhere, then we need spaces in which those kind of freedoms can happen. So why this has become an issue now is that, as you say, in the past, the cultural sector, actually I shouldn't even say it like, as soon as I say the cultural sector, I'm using exactly the kind of language that I'm rejecting, a sector. But the cultural area, let's just call it area, the cultural area provided those spaces, but especially, I don't know to what extent it's happened here, but in Britain, every single museum or art gallery of any size is conscious of the issue of branding. They all know about branding. They all have people who they work with who know about branding and marketing and how to attract audiences. And what I'm saying is that this becomes a kind of formula which is applied. And the trouble with the formula is it keeps producing similar looking solutions. So in a way, you wonder over time whether it can possibly even be effective, because all it's going to do is kind of reduce the possibilities to the lowest possible level, and in the end the outcomes, and it's already happened, the visual outcomes will be so boring it's hard to believe that they really get anyone very excited. So yeah, I mean there is a question here. Is it elitist to say, wow, these posters are meant for clever or intelligent people. Is that unacceptable? Is that exclusionary? If we say that, we acknowledge that, you know, actually you need a certain educational level or cultural awareness to understand something. Are we excluding all those people who don't have that cultural awareness or educational level? The easy answer today, the automatic answer, because we're all populists and we're all democratic and all, you know, I'm sounding sceptical, I know, but is to say, well, that's you're excluding people. What I think, this is my perspective, but maybe I'm deluded, but this is what I honestly think. I do base it in my observation of my own experience growing up. So there was a point where I knew nothing whatsoever about culture, and I wasn't getting it in the family home. So whatever I found out by going out into the world. And I felt perfectly able to do this, and this is back in the 1970s, when no one had even used the word outreach. I simply looked around, noticed some interesting things, looked at them, read them, you know, got into them, and then followed the links. People think, imagine this all happened post-internet. Hey, one thing links to another. No, you could always follow the links. It was just a slower process, or you had to go to a library. But, you know, it's always been about one thing leads to another. And then when you're doing that, you are defining your own personal cultural path. And over time, that will make you who you are. So yes, I would agree. We don't want to be so exclusionary that we stop people doing that who might want to do it or enjoy doing it or just need a bit of encouragement to do it. But what we don't need to do is to say, in effect, you're not very well educated, you're not very clever, are you? So we better give you something that's really easy to understand, which will wrap up really neatly and present in a way that's utterly familiar to you. This is just hugely patronising. I mean, that's why actually I would make a case for work that is awkward or difficult, or you have to make an effort, because actually this is the work that encourages us to keep going up to the next level. So again, when I think back to my own experience when young, I loved the fact that things were above my head. Why would I just want things on my own level? What am I going to learn from that? I need to keep moving upwards. And I think, I would say that's broadly true of anyone who wants to find out about any subject, and here we're talking about culture and the arts, needs to go on that, step by step. You don't go from here to up there, but you go up slowly. So, yeah, that's why I'm making a defence of, if you like, difficult work, or work that doesn't make things immediately obvious. And it actually doesn't matter. Well, it may matter in terms of getting, as we say in English, bums on seats. It may matter if you produce work that's not attractive enough. But in terms of people's personal cultural path, it doesn't matter at all if you don't get something. Maybe you'll get the next thing, and that's what will lift you, and then you'll begin to understand the things you didn't get before. So I think, actually, in the end, I think that what I'm saying here is not elitist at all, but it simply says, some things require work, and if you want to get those things, sorry, you'll have to do the work. But so what? So what? If you want to be a great athlete, you don't go from, stumbling around the track to breaking records, do you? You spend months and years of punishing work to get there. Why is that acceptable in the realm of athletics? That's really elitist to be a physical kind of giant of a person, super developed in your every little muscle. That's seen as great, but the idea you could want to do, or some people have done, or you should do the same thing in culture, is elitist or exclusionary. That in itself enshrines an ideology and a series of value judgments. So yeah, I personally reject that, and that's why I do come back to this this body of work, because I see it as an amazing example of what was possible here at that moment in time. And of course, no, I don't think anyone's going to create posters, with 4 or 6 sheets now filling. No, but some new thing, some equivalent thing, that might be possible. So that's the message to take away, I think. Sorry, you really pressed a button there, because I think this is such an important topic. It really is.